Have you watched the news lately? Or looked outside? If you have, you've probably seen that racial profiling and racism is a big part of our society and culture today. So that's why for my speech on information and diversity, I decided to dig into the effects of racism and how it can affect our society and culture. Now, our nation's history of racism has been well documented. From the slave trade of the 1800s to the profiling of the 21st century, there's always been racism present. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, the Jim Crow laws and segregation were a massive part of racism. African Americans didn't have the equal rights that white people did. But thanks to the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders, African Americans were able to have the same rights that white people exercised back in those days. But it brings me to my main point of today, the 21st century, where racial profiling is a major issue. And here are my examples, and most notably, the Michael Brown case. Now, if you've been keeping up with CNN or other reports, you would see that Ferguson is in a lot of turmoil right now based off of the acts of a white police officer. Now, most people believe that it was an act of racial profiling because he targeted an 18-year-old African American. Needless to say, it's created a lot of turmoil and a lot of violence in our society and our country. Another example would be the 9/11 attacks that caused the stereotype of Muslims. Now think about this. If you were in an airport and you saw a Middle Eastern man wearing a turban, the first thing that comes to your mind is, well, that guy must be a part of Al-Qaeda, or he's a terrorist. It's a stigma like that that was created from these attacks, and most people kind of still have that stereotype or that image when they think of a particular ethnicity or a particular religion. And my last subject would probably have to be my last example of the 21st century profiling would probably just have to be the way that people are perceived. For example, Mavericks owner, businessman, entrepreneur Mark Cuban stated in an interview that he had his own stereotypes of what he thought a black person was. Sagging pants, hooded overhead, and he created the stereotype that black people were dangerous, or that they dress a certain way. And it's just stigmas like those that create that racist profiling image in our minds. Now, people think, well, yeah, so what? This happens every day. What are the effects? Well, as you can see, it's created a lot of turmoil and violence in our society throughout history. Of course, it started off, it's kind of evolved though. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King would do peace marches. He would do peaceful protests. But now, people are burning down buildings, shooting each other. It's crazy. And not only does racism and racial profiling create violence, it creates trust issues in our government. People are questioning our police system. People think, oh boy, well, we better not commit any crimes or we might get shot by the police. And, it's an unfair, it's unfair, I would say. Most notably, 2 Ferguson police officers were attacked. In an article for the Wall Street Journal by Ben Kingsley and Mark Peters, they quoted how they were investigating the shootings and the motivation, and they believe that the motivation was based off of the Ferguson shootings. Now lastly, how racism can affect our society is it just creates a lot of tension. People really don't, ethnic groups just kind of, they look at each other a different way when something bad happens, like what happened in Ferguson. It takes a while to heal the relationship when a bad circumstance like that happens. And honestly, it leads me to my last point of how can we make a difference? And being a strong Christian that I am, I always have to point to just love each other, respect each other for their differences or, for their beliefs, and leave it at that. It doesn't matter what religion they are. what color their skin is. Just love everyone. Treat each other like you would like to be treated. And that's how, and to conclude my speech, I would just like to say that racism has always been a part of society, and unfortunately, it always will be. Racism isn't a genetic or hereditary thing that's carried on from generation to generation. It's taught generation to generation. The only way that we're ever going to stop racism is if, well, everyone from this generation can stop teaching it to their youth and to the next generation. If not for that, then there will never be an end to racism. But I urge you and I persuade you to just live your life every day treating each other as you like to be treated, and just live by the golden rule. Thank you.